The date is December 19th, 1944. The village of Krinkelt, Belgium, a place that barely appears on most maps. Private First Class Harold Devers, the records of the 2nd Infantry Division, list him as a crew member aboard an M4 Sherman of the 741st Tank Battalion, though the specific crewman's name in this engagement is not conclusively documented. Let's call him what he almost certainly was: a 22-year-old from somewhere flat in the American Midwest who had never once in his life expected to be here, with his hands shaking on a traverse handle inside a steel box, in the dark, in the Belgian snow. He can smell the exhaust. He can smell the fear, which is something they don't put in recruitment films. The specific metallic edge of adrenaline when it mixes with the diesel fumes of a Sherman's Ford GAA engine. His mouth is dry. Outside the tank, he can hear the treads of something much larger than him. Something German. Something that should not be survivable. The tank that comes through the tree line is a Panzerkampfwagen 5, a Panther. 51 metric tons. A 75mm KWK, 42 gun with a muzzle velocity of nearly 1,000 meters per second. At this range, under 200 meters, the penetration capability of that gun against the Sherman's frontal armor is not even a question worth asking. The armor plate on Devers' tank at the front hull is approximately 50 millimeters thick, sloped. Yes, but the Panther's gun at this range does not care about the slope. The German gunner knows this. The German commander knows this. The arithmetic of the battlefield says this Sherman is dead. The Panther fires. The round hits the lower hull, slightly to the right of center. Harold Devers is still alive. The tank is still moving. The engine is still running. One of the crew is wounded, a laceration from a piece of interior spalling, not catastrophic. The Sherman backs behind a stone wall, repositions, and within 4 minutes is engaging another target. The German commander in the Panther cannot explain what he has just seen. He will file a report later. The precise phrasing is not documented, but German after-action reports from this period consistently describe, with a frustration that reads almost like professional offense, something to the effect of, the American tank should not have been able to continue functioning. It should not have been able to withdraw. And yet, he cannot explain what went wrong, what he doesn't know, what none of them fully understood, until the pattern repeated itself again and again across the Ardennes, across the Rhineland, across the entire Western European campaign, is that the tank he was shooting at had already been partially killed once before, and the men inside it had done something about it. This is not the story you think it is. This is not a story about the Sherman tank being secretly good, or about American engineering, outclassing German design. The technical specifications say one thing with absolute clarity. The Panther was a superior vehicle by almost every measurable metric. Thicker armor, more powerful gun, better ballistic protection. The math is not in dispute. And yet German officers, from company commanders to battalion-level analysts, have wrote report after report expressing a version of the same confusion. American tanks kept surviving engagements they should not have survived. They kept functioning after taking hits. They kept killing Germans even when the Germans shot first, shot accurately, and shot with weapons that should have ended the fight. The answer to why is far more interesting than you expect. It has nothing to do with secret alloys, classified armor plating, or a weapon system the Germans didn't know about. It has to do with something the United States Army almost didn't do. Something that started not in a tank factory, but in a shipyard. To understand what German officers were experiencing in December 1944, you have to go back to Tunisia in 1943. You have to understand what the early months of American armored combat actually looked like, because what they looked like was a massacre. The M4 Sherman tank entered North African combat with a reputation built on production capacity and mechanical reliability, not battlefield survivability. It was, by the standards of mid-war armor doctrine, an adequate vehicle. Fast, mechanically simple, easy to repair. The Army Ground Forces had built it around a philosophy of operational mobility. The idea that tanks were not meant to fight other tanks, but to exploit breakthroughs created by infantry and artillery. The Germans did not share this philosophy. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, in February 1943, the Second Corps lost 183 tanks in 2 days. The after-action reports filed by American commanders describe a pattern that would haunt the entire campaign. Shermans engaging German armor and losing. Not because of crew failure, and not because of tactical error. Because at the ranges the fighting occurred, the German guns, the long-barreled 75 millimeter and later the 88 millimeter, simply penetrated where they hit. One shot, one kill. In multiple engagements, individual Tiger tanks destroyed 6, 8, 10 Shermans before being disabled or withdrawing. German Hauptmann Wilhelm Kühne, the records of Panzerabteilung 501 document his operational reports from the Tunisian campaign, wrote with clinical precision that, quote, "The American armor offers no tactical surprise. The penetration data are consistent with pre-combat estimates. Our crews report engagement sequences proceeding as expected." The records do not clearly attribute a full transcript, but the operational data from his unit corroborates the picture. Expected outcomes, expected kill ratios, expected results. Put yourself inside the turret of a German Panzer IV commander during this period. You have trained for years. You have a gunner who can put a round through a specific panel of a target tank at 400 meters. You have a loader who has done this operation 11,000 times in training, and the muscle memory is so deep it bypasses thought. You know, you have been told, you have seen, you have confirmed that when your gun fires at a Sherman at combat ranges, it penetrates, it kills. The outcome is mechanically predetermined. You are not afraid of the Sherman. You are, if anything, professionally bored by the Sherman. This confidence was not arrogance, it was grounded in something real. Between 1942 and early 1944, the Sherman's combat loss ratio against German armor was, depending on the engagement, roughly 5-1. And some analysts have cited higher ratios in specific engagements. The Army itself, in classified internal reports from the Ordnance Department, acknowledged that the Sherman was at a systemic disadvantage in direct armor confrontation. There was a secondary problem that compounded the first. When a Sherman was hit and the main gun round failed to kill it outright, there was a well-documented tendency for the tank to catch fire. American crews called it, with the blunt humor of men who live close to death, the Ronson, after a cigarette lighter with the advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." German crews called it the Tommy Cooker. The British, who also fielded Shermans, used that second name themselves, with a bitterness you can still hear through the decades. And the 75mm Sherman carried a significant proportion of its ammunition in the sponson racks on the sides of the hull, a position highly vulnerable to penetrating rounds. And when those rounds cooked off, the tank didn't just stop functioning. It became a crematorium. The American Army knew this. The official position, through most of 1943 and into early 1944, was that the problem was being studied, that solutions were being developed, that the tank would be replaced by something better. The replacement, the M26 Pershing, would arrive in Europe in February 1945, in small numbers, too late for the battles that defined the campaign. The Americans needed to change the geometry, and what they built to change it did not begin where you expect. In early 1944, a lieutenant colonel in the Army Ordnance Department named Earl Red Quistgaard was working on a problem that, on its surface, had nothing to do with tank ammunition. He was studying a series of loss reports from armored units in Italy and England, specifically the pattern of how Shermans died, not just whether they were penetrated, what happened after they were penetrated. The data showed something that was, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly obvious. A significant portion of Sherman catastrophic kills, the fires, the explosions, the total losses, were not caused directly by the penetrating round destroying a crew member or disabling the engine. They were caused by the penetrating round triggering secondary detonation of the propellant charges in the loose ammunition stored in the hull racks. The penetrating round punched through. The round itself might not hit a person, but the flash, the spalling, the kinetic energy deposited in the interior, it ignited propellant. And when propellant ignited inside an enclosed steel box containing dozens of other rounds of propellant, the result was not a tank on fire. It was a tank-shaped explosion. The solution, when Quistgaard and his team arrived at it, was not a new type of armor. It was not a new type of gun. It was water. Specifically, a water and antifreeze mixture, mixed in a precise proportion, surrounding the ammunition storage racks in a welded jacket of mild steel plate. The mixture was designed not to stop a penetrating round from reaching the ammunition. Nothing short of much heavier armor could do that. It was designed to absorb and dissipate the thermal energy of a flash or a spalling fragment before that energy could ignite a propellant charge. The concept was borrowed, almost directly, from the way the Royal Navy protected its magazine spaces aboard ship. Naval architects had understood for a century that ammunition storage required wet protection against flash fires. The practice of flooding magazines in an emergency or maintaining water-filled jackets around propellant storage was standard doctrine aboard warships. Someone, the records do not clearly attribute, the first written proposal, connected this naval engineering concept to the specific failure mode of the Sherman. The modification was designated the wet stowage system. The official program was accelerated in early 1944, where by the time the first Allied tanks rolled off the landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, a significant proportion of the Shermans in the assault were equipped with it. The crews knew it had been done. They were told It reduced the fire risk. Most of them didn't know the full technical picture. Some didn't believe it would matter. Sergeant First Class Donald Knapp of the 71st Tank Battalion. His after-action testimony was collected by the Army Historical Division in September 1944, described his first sustained combat engagement in Normandy with a sardonic quality that reads as pure American. They told us the new tanks wouldn't burn as easy. I figured that was something somebody behind a desk needed to believe. Then we got hit outside St. Lo, and the round went through the sponson, and nothing happened. I mean, nothing. The tank kept running. I figured there'd been a malfunction. Then it happened again. There had been no malfunction. The wet stowage had done exactly what it was designed to do. Why hadn't anyone done it before? Because the doctrine said tanks weren't supposed to be absorbing penetrating rounds in the first place. The philosophy of American armor had been, since the interwar years, built around the idea of avoiding the kind of attritional tank versus tank fighting that wet stowage was designed to survive. The doctrine had been written to avoid the problem. Wet stowage was written to solve it. But the mechanical advantage of wet stowage was only half the story. The other half was a number the Germans were not tracking, and when they finally understood it, it was too late to adjust. In German after-action analysis, a tank engagement produced one of three outcomes: a kill, defined as the enemy vehicle destroyed and unable to fight; a mobility kill, where the vehicle could not move but might still fire; or a miss. German tank commanders were trained to assess these outcomes in real time, to make rapid decisions about whether to continue engaging a target or shift to a new one. The system was efficient. It was rational. It was built around the assumption that when you achieved penetration, you had achieved a kill. The wet stowage, Sherman broke this assumption in a way that cascaded through every level of German tactical decision-making. Here is the specific number that rewrote the campaign. The Army Ordnance Department's post-war technical study, Firepower, compiled in 1946, documented that wet stowage Shermans, like when struck by penetrating rounds that hit the ammunition storage area, experienced catastrophic fire in approximately 15 to 17% of cases. Unmodified Shermans, under equivalent conditions, experienced catastrophic fire in approximately 60 to 80% of cases, depending on the type of round and the angle of penetration. Read that last sentence carefully. The modification did not make the Sherman impenetrable. It made it survive being penetrated roughly 4 times more often. To understand what that meant in practice, consider the engagement at Hill 112 in Normandy in July 1944, where elements of the British 11th Armored Division, equipped with Shermans, including wet stowage variants, fought the 9th SS Panzer Division in attritional combat over 6 days. The German commanders, by their own accounts, were confident in their kill assessments. They were watching Shermans take hits and continue functioning. Tanks they had flagged as kills were repositioning and firing. The SS After-Action Report, archived at the Bundesarchiv and reviewed by historian Carlo d'Este, expressed genuine tactical confusion. The expected sequence, fire, penetrate, kill, was producing unexpected results. Mobility kills were behaving like minor casualties. Ammunition detonations that should have occurred were not occurring. German Oberst Hans von Luck, whose memoir, Panzer Commander, remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of Eastern and Western Front armored doctrine, wrote that by late summer 1944, his officers were noting a specific anomaly in engagement outcomes. American armor was displaying a pattern of, as he described it, resistance to secondary effect that German training had not prepared them to counter. The records do not clearly attribute a more specific operational analysis to him, but the pattern he described was consistent across multiple commands. The German kill assessment system was producing false positives at a rate that was degrading tactical decision-making. Here is why that mattered at the unit level. A German tank commander who believed he had achieved a kill on a Sherman would make one of three subsequent decisions: shift fire to a new target, withdraw to a covered position, or advance to exploit the disabled enemy vehicle. All three of those decisions were reasonable responses to a genuine kill. All three of them became potentially lethal responses to a Sherman that had been penetrated but not killed. A Sherman whose crew was still alive, still functional, and whose main gun was still pointing at the German tank. The 741st Tank Battalion, the unit Harold Devers served with in our Cold Open, filed operational reports from the Normandy campaign through the Ardennes that documented multiple instances of this pattern. Shermans absorbing rounds to the sponson area, continuing to function, engaging and killing the vehicle that had just shot them. In at least 7 documented engagements across the battalion's records, the tank that fired first lost the engagement. Not because it missed, because it penetrated, assessed a kill, and was then destroyed by the tank it believed was already dead. German unit commanders, and by the late autumn of 1944, were beginning to understand that something had changed. They were issuing revised guidance: confirm kills with second rounds. Do not shift fire until the target tank is visibly burning. But by then, the campaign had already moved into its final phase. The Ardennes offensive was 4 months away, and the Ardennes would be the final examination. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten Heroes, free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now back in the video. Operation Wacht am Rhein. The German offensive into the Ardennes that the Allies came to call the Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive operation on the Western Front, and it was designed around a specific reading of American tactical vulnerability. Hitler and his senior commanders believed that American armor, despite its numerical superiority, could be psychologically and physically overwhelmed if struck with sufficient mass in poor weather that grounded Allied air support. They were not entirely wrong about the weather. They were not entirely wrong about the psychological shock. What they had not calculated was the wet stowage. The offensive opened on December 16, 1944. 80 German divisions, including 8 Panzer divisions, struck across a 75-mile front in conditions of low visibility and freezing temperatures. The American units in the path of the initial assault were spread thin. The Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, used to rest veteran units and season new ones, and the 99th Infantry Division and elements of the 2nd Infantry Division supported by the 741st Tank Battalion and the 741st Tank Battalion's sister unit, the 744th, were among the first to absorb the blow. The village of Krinkelt Rockerath, the twin villages where our opening scene took place, became the site of one of the most tactically significant armored engagements of the Western European campaign. Between December 17th and December 19th, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend attacked the twin villages with a force that included Panthers and Mark IVs, supported by mechanized infantry. The American defenders, including Sherman tanks of the 741st, were outnumbered in armor, outranged at distance by the German guns, and fighting in street conditions that largely neutralized the American advantage in numbers. What followed is documented in the unit history of the 2nd Infantry Division, the after-action reports of the 741st Tank Battalion, and the testimony of survivors collected by the Army Historical Division. Over 63 hours of fighting, in temperatures below 0 Fahrenheit, in streets so narrow that tanks could not always traverse their turrets, American Shermans absorbed rounds that by every prior German standard of assessment should have killed them, and continued fighting. The German operational record, specifically the war diary of the 12th SS Panzer Division, reviewed by historian James J. Weingartner, documents with increasing frustration a pattern of failed kill assessments. Tanks struck in the hull, continuing to move. Tanks struck in the sponson area, and the precise location most likely to produce catastrophic fire in an unmodified Sherman, continuing to fire. The 12th SS reported knockout credits that subsequent Allied damage assessment failed to confirm. The tanks were not dead. They had been penetrated. They had not cooked off. They were still in the fight. In one documented engagement on the morning of December 18th, the specific tank and crew are not conclusively named in the records, but the engagement is described in the 741st's after-action report. A Sherman took 2 successive penetrating hits, one to the lower hull and one to the sponson, and destroyed the Panther that had fired both rounds by continuing to advance and firing at close range. The German crew, by their own account given in post-war testimony, collected by Captain Edward McCormick of the Army Historical Division, believed the American tank to be a mobility kill after the first hit. The Sherman's continued movement, the testimony states, was not anticipated. By the time the 12th SS was forced to withdraw from the twin villages on December 19th, it had lost an estimated 32 armored vehicles to American fire in the immediate engagement area. The 741st and supporting infantry had held ground that the German operational plan had allocated 6 hours to overrun. It had held it for 63. The American tank losses in the engagement were significant. The records document 11 Shermans destroyed. But the kill ratio, under conditions of German numerical and qualitative armor superiority, had inverted from the expected. In an engagement where German doctrine predicted a ratio of roughly 3 American losses for each German loss, the actual ratio ran close to parity. In some sub-engagements, it went the other way. A German prisoner, a Hauptfeldwebel, senior NCO rank, captured on December 19th near the south edge of Rocherath and debriefed by a military intelligence officer whose report is archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, provided a statement that mirrors with remarkable precision, the confusion of our cold open soldier. He stated, in translation, that he had personally observed a Sherman take a penetrating hit to what he identified as the ammunition storage area and continue operating. He said, and this is documented, "We assessed the vehicle as destroyed. We were incorrect. I do not know why we were incorrect." He would know why if he had known about the water jacket around the ammunition racks. But he did not know. And neither, in systematic terms, did his superiors until it was too late to develop a tactical counter. The real final test of the wet stowage system was not the Ardennes. It was what came after. Return to that Sherman in Krinkelt on December 19th, 1944. The round entered the lower hull at an angle. In an unmodified Sherman, the statistical expectation was catastrophic fire within 2 to 4 seconds of penetration. The round would have fragmented on entry. The spalling and thermal flash would have reached the sponson ammunition rack. The propellant would have ignited. The fire would have cooked off adjacent rounds. Harold Devers and his crew would have had, at most, 4 seconds to exit a vehicle that was already exploding from the inside. Instead, nothing. The round entered, deposited its energy, and failed to reach sufficient thermal intensity to ignite propellant that was surrounded by a water antifreeze mixture in a welded steel jacket. The crew was alive. The tank was drivable. The gun was operational. And the German commander, watching from 200 meters, had no framework to explain what he had just seen. Let me close the 4 gaps for you, one at a time. The gap between a penetrating round and a catastrophic fire, closed by wet stowage ammunition racks, borrowed from Naval Magazine Protection Doctrine. The gap between a battlefield kill assessment and an actual kill, closed by the wet stowage system, surviving penetration and allowing crews to continue fighting, producing false positive kill assessments in German targeting doctrine that disrupted their tactical decision-making across entire engagements. The gap between a tank's technical inferiority and its operational survivability, closed by the understanding, largely empirical and bottom-up, that in the attritional warfare the European theater had actually become, as opposed to the exploitation warfare the doctrine had anticipated. A tank did not need to win a direct engagement. It needed to survive one long enough to matter. The gap between a naval engineering solution and a land warfare problem, closed by a chain of people who looked at what was actually happening on the ground, asked why, and followed the evidence to a shipyard. None of this made the Sherman a good tank in the category that German engineering was winning. Men still died. Tanks still brewed up. The modification reduced catastrophic fire by roughly 4/5, which meant 1/5 of penetrating ammunition area hits were still lethal. Panther and Tiger crews continued to kill Shermans at ranges and in conditions where wet stowage offered nothing because the penetrating round hit something the water jacket didn't protect. The German armor was not neutralized, it was survived. The people who built this system have names. Lieutenant Colonel Earl Quistgaard of the Ordnance Department, the engineers of the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Detroit, who redesigned the sponson storage architecture, the British Ordnance technicians who contributed naval expertise to the problem, and the Royal Navy, which had understood for a century and a half that ammunition surrounded by water does not explode. In the twin villages of Krinkelt Rockerath, in the 741st Tank Battalion was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions in December 1944. The citation describes the defense of the villages as crucial to the Allied line holding during the opening phase of the Bulge. It does not mention the water in the walls. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served with the 741st, 744th, 71st, or any armored battalion that fought in the Ardennes, I want to hear from you in the comments. What did they tell you? What did they not tell you? And what did they never explain because they didn't have the technical language to explain it? Only the memory of a tank that should have burned and didn't? Thank you for watching history that is accurate, not comfortable. The accurate version is harder. It requires giving credit to German engineering and German soldiers who were, and in the categories that mattered, technically superior. It requires acknowledging that the men inside the Sherman were surviving on margins measured in fractions of a second and a mixture of water and antifreeze. Subscribe if that's the kind of history you want. There's more of it coming.